There's something happening in marriages today that would shock you if you knew the full truth. Right now, as I speak to you, there are couples sitting in divorce lawyers' offices, signing papers that will tear apart what God intended to be unbreakable. But here's what's really disturbing about this whole situation. These same couples, just months ago, were desperately searching for answers, trying everything they could think of to save their marriages. They went to counseling, they read books, they attended workshops, they even tried those relationship apps that promised to fix everything. And yet, here they are, giving up on the very covenant that was designed to reflect Christ's love for the church. But what if I told you there's something these couples never discovered? What if I told you that buried within the teachings of Jesus are relationship principles so powerful, so transformative, that they can literally resurrect a marriage that everyone else has given up for dead? Now, you might be thinking this sounds too good to be true, and I understand that skepticism. You've probably heard plenty of marriage advice before. But what you're about to discover isn't just another relationship strategy. This is something that relationship experts are now discovering was hidden in plain sight for over 2,000 years. Here's what shocked me when I first uncovered this. The same principles that Jesus used to transform broken, hurting people into devoted followers are the exact same principles that can transform a broken, hurting marriage into something more beautiful than you ever imagined possible. And the reason most couples never experience this transformation isn't because their problems are too big or because they've hurt each other too deeply. It's because they don't know these specific principles that Jesus demonstrated over and over again in his relationships with people. I'm about to share with you a true story that will illustrate exactly what I mean. But before I do, I need you to understand something crucial. Your marriage isn't broken beyond repair, no matter what you've been told, no matter what you've experienced, and no matter how hopeless things might seem right now. Your heart is wired to respond to these ancient techniques because they tap into the very way God designed relationships to function. When you understand what I'm about to show you, you'll realize that every marriage struggle you've faced has actually been preparing you for this moment of breakthrough. Let me tell you about Sarah and Michael. They'd been married for 12 years when Sarah called me, sobbing so hard I could barely understand what she was saying. Michael had just told her he wanted a separation. He'd already found an apartment, already talked to a lawyer, and as far as he was concerned, their marriage was over. The devastating part wasn't just that he was leaving. It was the way he looked at her when he said it, like she was a stranger, like all those years together meant nothing to him anymore. Sarah told me they'd tried everything. They'd been to 3 different marriage counselors. They'd read every book on relationships they could find. They'd even gone on those romantic getaways that are supposed to rekindle the spark. But nothing worked. In fact, things seemed to get worse after each attempt. The counseling sessions turned into blame sessions. The books made them feel like failures because nothing they tried seemed to stick. And those romantic getaways? They just highlighted how disconnected they'd become. Now, here's where this story takes an unexpected turn. Sarah had grown up in church, but she'd never really thought about applying Jesus' actual methods to her marriage. Like most of us, she'd heard the generic advice about love and forgiveness, but she'd never studied how Jesus specifically dealt with broken relationships, how he restored people who had given up hope, how he transformed hearts that had become hardened by hurt and disappointment. But here's what's really interesting about Jesus' approach to relationships. When you study his interactions with people, you discover that he never just told them to try harder or be better. Instead, he used specific psychological and spiritual principles that addressed the root causes of relational breakdown. And when Sarah finally learned these principles and began applying them to her marriage, something extraordinary happened. Within just 7 days of implementing the first principle, Michael called off the separation. Within 3 weeks, he was asking Sarah to help him understand what had changed in her, because he felt drawn to her in a way he hadn't experienced in years. And within 2 months, they were experiencing a level of intimacy and connection that surpassed even their honeymoon phase. But this isn't just Sarah and Michael's story. This is happening for couples all over the world who are discovering what the Bible revealed about relationships 2,000 years ago. Relationship researchers are now confirming what Jesus demonstrated through his ministry. The principles he used to heal broken people and restore damaged relationships are based on fundamental truths about how the human heart and mind actually function. You see, your brain is wired to respond to certain relational patterns in predictable ways. When these patterns are activated correctly, they trigger the release of neurochemicals like oxytocin and dopamine that literally create feelings of love, connection, and attachment. This isn't just spiritual truth, it's neuroscience. And Jesus, being the creator of the human brain, knew exactly which patterns would produce which results in relationships. The problem is that most marriage advice focuses on behavior modification rather than heart transformation. It tells you what to do differently without addressing why you're doing what you're doing in the first place. It's like trying to treat symptoms while ignoring the disease. You might get temporary relief, but the underlying issues remain unchanged. Jesus took a completely different approach. When he encountered people in broken relationships, he didn't start with their behavior. He started with their identity, their worth, their understanding of love itself. He knew that lasting change in relationships could only happen when people experienced a fundamental shift in how they saw themselves and how they understood love to function. Let me show you exactly what I mean by walking you through the first principle that transformed Sarah and Michael's marriage. I call it the principle of radical acceptance, and it's based on how Jesus interacted with the woman caught in adultery. Now, you might be wondering how a story about adultery applies to your marriage, but stay with me because this is where it gets powerful. When the religious leaders brought this woman to Jesus, they were ready to condemn her, to focus on everything she'd done wrong, to make her shame and failure the center of attention. Sound familiar? This is exactly what happens in most struggling marriages. We become so focused on our spouse's failures, their mistakes, their shortcomings, that we completely lose sight of their inherent worth and value. But Jesus did something revolutionary. Instead of joining the chorus of condemnation, he chose to see past her actions to her heart. He chose to respond to who she was created to be rather than who she had become through her choices. And this choice to see her through the lens of radical acceptance created an environment where genuine transformation became possible. Here's what shocked me when I first understood this principle. The reason most marriage restoration attempts fail isn't because people don't want to change. It's because they're trying to change in an environment of judgment and condemnation rather than acceptance and love. When your spouse feels constantly criticized, evaluated, and found wanting, their nervous system goes into defensive mode. And when someone is in defensive mode, they literally cannot access the parts of their brain responsible for empathy, connection, and genuine change. But when you learn to apply Jesus' principle of radical acceptance, something miraculous happens. You create what psychologists call a secure relational environment. In this environment, your spouse's nervous system can relax, their defenses can come down, and they can begin to access their capacity for love, growth, and transformation. Now, this doesn't mean you ignore problems or pretend everything is fine when it's not. Radical acceptance isn't denial. It's choosing to separate your spouse's identity from their behavior. It's choosing to respond to their heart rather than their actions. It's choosing to see them through God's eyes rather than through the lens of your hurt and disappointment. When Sarah first heard this principle, she was resistant. She told me, "But Michael has hurt me so deeply. He's been emotionally distant, he's been critical, he's even been cruel at times. How can I just accept that?" And I understood her struggle because this principle challenges everything we've been taught about relationships. But here's what I explained to Sarah, and what I want you to understand. Radical acceptance isn't about excusing harmful behavior or staying in an abusive situation. It's about recognizing that the person who is hurting you is also a person who is hurting. It's about understanding that their harmful behavior is often a symptom of their own pain, their own fears, their own unmet needs. Jesus demonstrated this understanding perfectly. When he looked at the woman caught in adultery, he didn't see a terrible person doing terrible things. He saw a beloved daughter of God who had lost her way, who was trying to meet legitimate needs for love and connection in illegitimate ways. And his response to her heart rather than her actions created the space for her to experience genuine transformation. This is the part that changes everything in a marriage. When you begin to respond to your spouse's heart rather than their behavior, when you begin to see their actions as symptoms of deeper needs and fears rather than evidence of their character, you create an environment where healing becomes possible. But let me tell you what happened next with Sarah, because this is where the story gets really interesting. When she started applying this principle of radical acceptance, Michael's initial response was suspicion. He'd become so accustomed to criticism and conflict that her new approach actually made him uncomfortable at first. He kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for her to go back to the patterns of blame and judgment that had characterized their relationship for so long. But Sarah persisted. Every time Michael was distant, instead of criticizing his withdrawal, she chose to see it as a sign that he was protecting a wounded heart. Every time he was critical, instead of defending herself or counterattacking, she chose to hear the fear and insecurity beneath his words. Every time he pulled away emotionally, instead of pursuing him with demands and accusations, she chose to create space for him to feel safe enough to return. And here's what's fascinating about this process. As Sarah changed her responses, Michael's nervous system began to shift out of defensive mode. The constant state of emotional threat that had characterized their relationship began to dissolve. And as his defenses came down, his capacity for empathy and connection began to emerge. This works even if you've tried everything else because it addresses the fundamental issue that most marriage advice misses. Most relationship strategies focus on communication techniques, conflict resolution skills, or behavior modification. But these approaches often fail because they don't address the underlying emotional environment of the relationship. Think about it this way. If you're trying to grow a garden in toxic soil, it doesn't matter how good your seeds are or how perfect your planting technique is. Nothing will thrive in that environment. Similarly, if you're trying to restore intimacy and connection in a relationship characterized by judgment, criticism, and emotional threat, it doesn't matter how good your communication skills are. Love cannot flourish in an environment of fear. But when you apply Jesus' principle of radical acceptance, you begin to transform the emotional soil of your relationship. You create an environment where love can take root and grow. You create safety where there was threat, acceptance where there was judgment, hope where there was despair. Now, you might be wondering how this applies to your specific situation. Maybe your spouse has betrayed you. Maybe they've been unfaithful, or dishonest, or emotionally abusive. How do you apply radical acceptance when you've been genuinely wronged? This is where the second principle comes into play, and it's based on how Jesus handled betrayal and forgiveness. When Jesus was betrayed by Judas, one of his closest friends, he didn't pretend it didn't hurt. He didn't minimize the pain or act like it was no big deal. But he also didn't allow the betrayal to define his response to Judas. Even in the moment of betrayal, Jesus called Judas friend. He continued to see Judas through the lens of their relationship rather than through the lens of his actions. This is crucial for marriage restoration because betrayal is often the point where couples give up hope. They believe that certain actions are unforgivable, that certain hurts are too deep to heal. But Jesus demonstrated that even the deepest betrayals don't have to define the future of a relationship. Here's what relationship researchers have discovered about forgiveness that aligns perfectly with Jesus' teachings. Forgiveness isn't primarily about the person who hurt you. It's about freeing yourself from the prison of resentment and bitterness. When you hold on to anger and hurt, you're not punishing your spouse, you're poisoning your own heart. You're keeping yourself trapped in the very pain you want to escape. But biblical forgiveness goes deeper than just letting go of resentment. It's about choosing to see your spouse through God's eyes, to remember that they are fearfully and wonderfully made, that they are loved by God even in their failure, that their identity is not defined by their worst moments. This doesn't mean you ignore the hurt or pretend it didn't happen. Jesus acknowledged the reality of betrayal while choosing not to be defined by it. Similarly, you can acknowledge the reality of your pain while choosing not to let that pain determine your response to your spouse. Let me share with you what happened when Sarah applied this principle to a specific betrayal in her marriage. About 3 years earlier, she had discovered that Michael had been having an emotional affair with a coworker. It wasn't physical, but he had been sharing intimate details about their marriage problems with this other woman, seeking emotional support and connection outside their marriage. The discovery had devastated Sarah. She felt betrayed, humiliated, and deeply insecure. Michael had ended the inappropriate relationship and promised it would never happen again, but Sarah had never fully forgiven him. She held on to the hurt, bringing it up during arguments, using it as evidence of his untrustworthiness, allowing it to poison her ability to be vulnerable with him. But as she learned about Jesus' approach to betrayal, she realized that her unforgiveness was actually preventing the very healing she desperately wanted. By continuing to define Michael by his failure, she was making it impossible for him to become the man she needed him to be. By holding on to the betrayal as evidence of his character, she was creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where he could never measure up to her expectations. So Sarah made a radical choice. She chose to forgive Michael not because he deserved it, but because she wanted to be free. She chose to see him not as the man who had betrayed her, but as the man God created him to be. She chose to respond to his potential rather than his past. The transformation was remarkable. As Sarah released her grip on the betrayal, Michael began to experience freedom from the shame and guilt that had been driving his defensive behavior. As she stopped defining him by his failure, he began to see himself through new eyes. As she chose to trust his heart rather than his history, he began to live up to that trust. But here's what's really interesting about this process. Sarah didn't just wake up one day and decide to forgive. Forgiveness, especially for deep hurts, is rarely a one-time event. It's more often a daily choice, a process of continually releasing resentment and choosing love instead. Jesus taught us to pray, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." The implication is that forgiveness is an ongoing practice, not a single decision. Every day, we have the choice to hold on to hurt or release it. Every day, we can choose to see our spouse through the lens of their failures or through the lens of God's love for them. This brings us to the third principle that Jesus demonstrated, and it's perhaps the most powerful one for marriage restoration. I call it the principle of redemptive love, and it's based on how Jesus transformed Peter after his denial. You remember the story? Peter, who had boldly declared that he would never deny Jesus, ended up doing exactly that when the pressure mounted. 3 times he denied even knowing Jesus, and the last time he did it with cursing and swearing. It was a complete moral failure, a total betrayal of everything he claimed to believe. But here's what's amazing about Jesus' response. After his resurrection, when he had the opportunity to confront Peter about his failure, he didn't focus on the denial. Instead, he gave Peter 3 opportunities to declare his love, essentially replacing each denial with an affirmation. He chose to focus on Peter's potential rather than his past, on his calling rather than his failure. This is redemptive love in action. It's the choice to see people not as they are, but as they can become. It's the decision to call forth their best self rather than constantly reminding them of their worst moments. It's the commitment to believe in their capacity for change even when they don't believe in it themselves. In marriage, redemptive love is the difference between a relationship that merely survives and one that truly thrives. It's the difference between 2 people who tolerate each other's weaknesses and 2 people who call forth each other's strengths. It's the difference between a marriage based on performance and a marriage based on potential. When you learn to love your spouse redemptively, you become a catalyst for their transformation. Your belief in who they can become gives them the courage to grow into that person. Your commitment to their potential gives them the security to risk change. Your love for their best self gives them the motivation to leave their worst self behind. But here's where it gets challenging. Redemptive love requires you to see with the eyes of faith rather than the eyes of experience. It requires you to believe in possibilities that you haven't seen yet. It requires you to invest in potential that may not have been realized. This is exactly what Sarah had to learn to do with Michael. She had to stop seeing him as the emotionally distant, critical man he had become and start seeing him as the loving, engaged husband he was created to be. She had to stop responding to his current behavior and start calling forth his best self. At first, this felt like denial to Sarah. She told me, "I feel like I'm living in a fantasy, pretending Michael is someone he's not." But I helped her understand the difference between denial and faith. Denial ignores reality. Faith sees current reality while believing in future possibility. Sarah wasn't pretending that Michael's emotional distance didn't exist. She was choosing to see it as something that could change rather than something that defined him. She wasn't ignoring his critical spirit. She was choosing to believe that underneath that criticism was a man who wanted to love and be loved but didn't know how to express it safely. And as Sarah began to respond to Michael's potential rather than his problems, something extraordinary happened. He began to rise to meet her expectations. When she spoke to his capacity for tenderness, he began to access that tenderness. When she affirmed his ability to be emotionally present, he began to show up more fully. When she expressed confidence in his love for her, he began to express that love more freely. This works because of a psychological principle called the Pygmalion effect. People tend to perform up or down to the expectations others have of them. When you consistently see and affirm the best in your spouse, you create an environment where their best self can emerge. When you consistently focus on their failures and limitations, you create an environment where those negative patterns are reinforced. Jesus understood this principle perfectly. He consistently called people to their highest potential. He saw an impulsive fisherman and called him Peter, the Rock. He saw a tax collector and called him to be a disciple. He saw a woman caught in adultery and called her to go and sin no more. In each case, his vision of their potential became a catalyst for their transformation. Now, let me address something that might be troubling you as you hear these principles. You might be thinking, this sounds like I have to do all the work while my spouse gets to continue behaving badly. And I understand that concern because it touches on a fundamental question about relationships. What do you do when you're the only one trying? Here's what I've discovered in over 2 decades of helping couples restore their marriages. Transformation in relationships rarely happens simultaneously. Usually, one person begins to change first, and that change creates an environment where the other person can begin to change as well. The question isn't whether both people are working on the relationship. The question is whether you're willing to be the one who starts the process. Jesus modeled this perfectly in his relationship with humanity. He didn't wait for us to get our act together before he demonstrated his love for us. He loved us while we were still sinners, while we were still his enemies, while we were still broken and rebellious. His love wasn't a response to our goodness. It was the catalyst that made our goodness possible. This is the heart of redemptive love in marriage. You don't wait for your spouse to deserve your love before you give it. You love them in a way that makes it easier for them to become lovable. You don't wait for them to change before you treat them with respect. You respect them in a way that calls forth their best self. But here's what's crucial to understand. This doesn't mean you become a doormat or enable destructive behavior. Jesus loved people unconditionally, but he also had clear boundaries. He accepted people where they were, but he didn't leave them there. He offered grace, but he also called people to repentance and transformation. Similarly, in marriage, redemptive love includes both acceptance and accountability. You can love your spouse unconditionally while still having clear expectations for how you will be treated. You can see their potential while still addressing their problematic behavior. You can offer grace while still requiring growth. The key is in how you do it. Instead of criticizing from a position of moral superiority, you address issues from a position of loving concern. Instead of demanding change through threats and ultimatums, you invite change through vision and encouragement. Instead of focusing on what's wrong with your spouse, you focus on what's possible for your relationship. Let me give you a practical example of how this works. Let's say your spouse has a pattern of being critical and harsh in their communication. The typical response would be to criticize their criticism, to point out how hurtful they're being, to demand that they stop talking to you that way. But redemptive love takes a different approach. Instead of focusing on the negative behavior, you focus on the positive potential. You might say something like, "I know you care about our relationship, and I can hear that you're frustrated. Help me understand what you need so we can work on this together." You're addressing the behavior while affirming their heart. You're creating space for them to express their concerns in a healthier way. This approach works because it gives your spouse a way to save face while changing their behavior. It acknowledges their legitimate concerns while redirecting their expression of those concerns. It treats them as a partner in solving the problem rather than as the problem itself. Sarah learned to apply this principle when Michael would become critical and harsh. Instead of defending herself or counterattacking, she would say something like, "I can see this is really important to you. I want to understand what you need from me." This response acknowledged his concerns while inviting a more constructive conversation. At first, Michael didn't know how to respond to this new approach. He was so accustomed to conflict that Sarah's non-defensive responses actually confused him. But gradually, he began to feel safer expressing his needs and concerns because he wasn't being met with resistance and defensiveness. This brings us to the fourth principle that Jesus demonstrated, and it's crucial for long-term marriage restoration. I call it the principle of patient persistence, and it's based on Jesus' parable of the persistent widow. In this parable, Jesus tells the story of a widow who keeps coming to an unjust judge, asking for justice against her adversary. The judge initially refuses to help her, but she keeps coming back, day after day, persistently making her request. Finally, the judge grants her request, not because he cares about justice, but because her persistence has worn him down. Jesus uses this parable to teach about prayer, but the principle applies beautifully to marriage restoration. Change in relationships doesn't happen overnight. It requires patient persistence, the willingness to keep loving, keep believing, keep investing even when you don't see immediate results. This is where many people give up on their marriages. They try the principles for a few days or weeks, don't see dramatic change, and conclude that their situation is hopeless. But lasting transformation in relationships is more like growing a garden than flipping a switch. It requires consistent care over time, patience through seasons of apparent dormancy, and faith that growth is happening even when it's not visible. Sarah had to learn this lesson the hard way. After about 2 weeks of applying these principles, she called me in frustration. "It's not working," she said. "Michael is still distant, still critical. Nothing has changed." But I helped her understand that change was happening, even if she couldn't see it yet. You see, when you begin to change your patterns in a relationship, your spouse's initial response is often to intensify their old patterns. Psychologists call this an extinction burst. It's like when you stop feeding a behavior, it gets worse before it gets better. Michael's emotional distance and critical spirit were actually getting more pronounced because his old strategies for protecting himself weren't working anymore. But Sarah persisted. She continued to respond with acceptance instead of criticism, with love instead of defensiveness, with faith instead of fear. And gradually, Michael's resistance began to soften. His defensiveness began to decrease. His capacity for intimacy began to emerge. The breakthrough came about 6 weeks into the process. Michael came home from work one evening, and instead of his usual pattern of isolating himself, he sat down next to Sarah and said, "I don't know what you've been doing differently, but I feel like I can breathe around you for the first time in years. I feel like you actually like me again." That conversation opened the door to deeper healing in their relationship. Michael began to share about the fears and insecurities that had been driving his defensive behavior. Sarah began to understand how her previous patterns of criticism and control had contributed to his emotional withdrawal. Together, they began to build a new foundation for their marriage based on acceptance, understanding, and redemptive love. But even after that breakthrough, the process wasn't finished. There were still setbacks, still moments when old patterns would resurface, still times when both of them had to choose love over self-protection. The difference was that they now had tools to navigate those challenges, principles that could guide them back to connection even when they drifted apart. This is the reality of marriage restoration using Jesus' principles. It's not a quick fix or a magic formula. It's a way of life, a commitment to love the way Jesus loved, to see people the way Jesus saw them, to believe in transformation the way Jesus believed in it. Now, let me share with you the fifth and final principle that ties all of this together. I call it the principle of sacrificial service, and it's based on Jesus washing his disciples' feet. On the night before his crucifixion, Jesus did something that shocked his disciples. He took off his outer garments, wrapped a towel around his waist, and began washing their feet. This was the job of a servant, not a master. It was a demonstration of love that went against every social convention of the time. But Jesus wasn't just making a point about humility. He was demonstrating the kind of love that transforms relationships. He was showing that true power in relationships comes not from being served, but from serving. He was illustrating that the way up in relationships is down, that the way to receive love is to give it, that the way to be honored is to honor others. This principle is revolutionary for marriage because it challenges our natural tendency to focus on what we're not getting from our spouse rather than what we can give to them. Most struggling marriages are characterized by two people who are keeping score, each one focused on how they're not being loved, appreciated, or respected by the other. But Jesus' principle of sacrificial service flips this dynamic completely. Instead of focusing on what you're not receiving, you focus on what you can give. Instead of demanding that your spouse meet your needs, you look for ways to meet theirs. Instead of waiting for them to serve you, you look for opportunities to serve them. This doesn't mean you become a doormat or ignore your own needs. Jesus served from a position of strength, not weakness. He knew who he was, he knew his worth, and he knew his mission. His service came from love, not from insecurity or people-pleasing. Similarly, in marriage, sacrificial service is most powerful when it comes from a secure sense of your own identity and worth. When you know you are loved by God, when you understand your value independent of your spouse's response to you, you can serve them freely without resentment or expectation. Sarah discovered this principle when she stopped focusing on all the ways Michael wasn't meeting her emotional needs and started looking for ways to meet his. She noticed that he felt most loved when she expressed appreciation for his hard work. So she began intentionally acknowledging his efforts to provide for their family, even when she didn't feel particularly grateful. She noticed that he felt most connected when they spent time together without distractions. So she began putting away her phone when he came home from work, giving him her full attention even when she had other things she wanted to do. She noticed that he felt most respected when she asked for his input on decisions rather than just informing him of what she had already decided. So she began including him in conversations about their schedule, their finances, their parenting decisions, even when it would have been easier to just handle things herself. At first, these acts of service felt forced and artificial to Sarah. She was doing them as a strategy to get Michael to be more loving toward her. But gradually, something shifted in her heart. As she focused on blessing Michael rather than on her own unmet needs, she began to experience a different kind of fulfillment. She discovered that there is indeed more joy in giving than in receiving. And Michael began to respond. As he felt more appreciated, more included, more valued, his defensive walls began to come down. As his needs were met, he had more emotional capacity to meet Sarah's needs. As he experienced sacrificial love, he became more capable of giving sacrificial love in return. This is the beautiful paradox of Jesus' principles. When you stop demanding love and start giving it, you often receive more love than you ever demanded. When you stop focusing on your own needs and start focusing on your spouse's needs, your own needs often get met in ways you never expected. When you stop trying to change your spouse and start changing yourself, your spouse often begins to change as well. But here's what's crucial to understand about all of these principles. They work not because they're manipulation techniques or psychological tricks, but because they align with the way God designed relationships to function. They tap into the deepest longings of the human heart, the fundamental needs for acceptance, security, and love that every person carries. When you apply these principles in your marriage, you're not just using a strategy. You're participating in the redemptive work that God wants to do in your relationship. You're becoming a conduit of His love, a demonstration of His grace, a picture of His heart for restoration and healing. And this is where I want to pause and pray with you, because I know that what I've shared might feel overwhelming. You might be thinking about all the hurt in your marriage, all the failed attempts at change, all the reasons why these principles might not work in your specific situation. You might be feeling hopeful but also afraid to hope, excited about the possibilities but also scared of being disappointed again. Father God, I come before you right now with every person who is listening to this message, every heart that is hurting, every marriage that is struggling. Lord, you know the pain that many of these couples have experienced. You know the betrayals, the disappointments, the years of trying and failing to connect with each other. You know the loneliness that can exist even in marriage, the frustration of loving someone who feels like a stranger, the exhaustion that comes from fighting the same battles over and over again. But God, you also know the love that brought these couples together in the first place. You know the dreams they had when they said their vows, the hopes they carried when they promised to love each other for better or worse, in sickness and in health, until death do them part. You know that underneath all the hurt and frustration, there are hearts that still long for connection, souls that still yearn to be known and loved and accepted. Lord, I pray that you would breathe new life into these marriages. I pray that you would take the principles that Jesus demonstrated and make them real and practical and applicable in each unique situation. I pray that you would give couples the courage to try again, the wisdom to know how to love each other well, and the patience to persist through the process of healing and restoration. For those who feel like they've tried everything and nothing has worked, I pray that you would give them hope. Help them to see that your ways are higher than our ways, that your love is more powerful than our failures, that your grace is sufficient for every situation. Help them to trust that you can do immeasurably more than all they ask or imagine, according to your power that is at work within them. For those who are afraid to be vulnerable again, who have been hurt so deeply that they've built walls around their hearts, I pray that you would give them the courage to risk love one more time. Help them to remember that perfect love casts out fear, that you have not given them a spirit of fear but of power and love and sound mind. Help them to trust that you can heal what has been broken and restore what has been lost. For those who feel like they're the only one trying, who are exhausted from carrying the weight of their marriage alone, I pray that you would give them strength. Help them to remember that you are with them, that you are for their marriage, that you are working even when they can't see it. Give them the grace to love sacrificially without keeping score, to serve without expecting immediate return, to persist without guarantee of success. Lord, I pray specifically for the marriages that are on the brink of divorce, where papers have been filed or lawyers have been consulted or separation is imminent. I pray that you would intervene in those situations, that you would soften hearts that have become hardened, that you would open eyes that have been blinded by hurt and anger. I pray that you would give these couples one more chance, one more opportunity to experience the transforming power of your love. And God, I pray for the children who are watching these marriages, who are learning about love and commitment and relationship from what they see at home. I pray that you would break generational cycles of dysfunction and pain. I pray that you would use the restoration of these marriages to create a legacy of love that will impact generations to come. Father, I know that you hate divorce, not because you want people to be miserable, but because you know the pain and devastation it brings. You designed marriage to be a picture of your love for the church, a demonstration of covenant faithfulness, a source of strength and support and companionship. I pray that you would restore that vision in the hearts of couples who have lost sight of it. Give them eyes to see each other the way you see them. Give them hearts to love each other the way you love them. Give them the wisdom to apply these principles with patience and grace and humility. Help them to remember that they are on the same team, fighting for their marriage rather than against each other. Lord, I commit these marriages into your hands. I trust that you are able to do what seems impossible, to heal what seems beyond repair, to restore what seems permanently broken. I pray that in the days and weeks and months to come, there will be testimonies of transformation, stories of redemption, marriages that become beautiful pictures of your grace and love. In Jesus' name I pray, Amen. Now, as we close, I want you to know that what you've learned today is just the beginning. These principles that Jesus demonstrated, these patterns of love and acceptance and redemption that can transform any marriage, they require practice and patience and persistence to fully implement. You can't just hear them once and expect everything to change overnight. But I also want you to know that you're not alone in this journey. There are couples all over the world who are discovering these same truths, who are applying these same principles, who are experiencing the same kind of transformation that Sarah and Michael experienced. You're part of a community of people who refuse to give up on love, who believe that God can restore what has been broken, who are committed to loving the way Jesus loved. And here's what I know about you if you've listened this far. You have a heart for your marriage. You have hope for restoration. You have the courage to try something different, to risk vulnerability one more time, to believe that your best days together are still ahead of you. That heart, that hope, that courage, they're gifts from God. They're evidence that He's not finished with your story yet. Tomorrow, I'm going to share with you the specific steps for implementing these principles in your daily life. I'm going to show you exactly how to create those moments of radical acceptance, how to practice redemptive love when your spouse disappoints you, how to persist with patience when change seems slow. Because knowing these principles is just the first step. The real transformation happens when you begin to live them out in the ordinary moments of married life.